Now, please observe something in the communication situation. Here is a speaker who mentions some words, and here is the listener. Now, there are two things that a listener can do. The listener can interpret the words as he would use them were he doing the talking. Or, and let's call that mode A, or the listener could attempt to interpret the words as the speaker meant them. To put it another way, one of our important difficulties in communication, I believe, arises because listeners tend to do A and never to mind B. Listeners tend to worry about what words mean rather than what the speaker means. We tend to be so taken and so hypnotized by the word itself that we pay no attention to what the speaker means. Now, it might well be that you would think that I was foolish or unwise to use words this way. That's possible, and I shouldn't deny that possible opinion. Nevertheless, when you say I was contradicting myself, you were looking at the meaning of the word giddy as you would be likely to use it. And thus we have a word we call bypassing. I may have been using the word in one way. You proceeded to interpret it another way. And thus we talk past each other. And we find that very, very often listeners tend to believe that speakers are using words as the listener would were the listener doing the talking. And if as a listener you attempt to look at the word apart from me, there is the danger that we will misunderstand each other. Now, sometimes the misunderstanding is frivolous and doesn't mean very much. In Cleveland, Robert Harris, 40, a handyman, was found guilty in traffic court of driving while drunk. $100 in costs, intoned Judge Perry Fry, to be executed by July 2nd. My God, Judge, exclaimed Harris, fainting dead away. When Harris was revived, Judge Fry explained that he was using the word executed as a technical legal term, and he merely meant that Harris had until July 2nd to pay the fine. Here is Harris interpreting the word execute in his way, which is all right. But if you do A without regard for the speaker, then we talk past each other. And sometimes there are the occasions in which this happens are quite frivolous. In New Mexico, when an airline hostess passed out chewing gum with the routine instruction for the ears, a lady passenger later complained, "It worked all right, but couldn't you use something not so sticky?" Well, what does for the ears mean? I should now like to say that that question is of lesser importance to us than what did the young lady mean? To ask the question, what did the word mean, is to put the emphasis on the wrong place in the communication line. I would like to draw another picture. I would like to draw a picture in which listeners are interested in what speakers mean and speakers speak to listeners, rather than someone talking to the word. Of course, sometimes this is very difficult and sometimes exceedingly embarrassing. There is a story that came out of the World War, the Second World War. The Army wanted to establish the newspaper Stars and Stripes in Europe, and found a young man named Sergeant Bill E., who was in the Corps of Engineers, and assigned him to the daily newspaper because on his classification card there was recorded his previous experience as the proprietor of a book establishment in Syracuse, New York. Now, it wasn't until several months later that somebody discovered that Sergeant E.'s book establishment didn't deal in fiction and nonfiction, it booked bets on the horses. Now, what does the phrase mean, proprietor of a book establishment? I should like to suggest that that's not as important a question as what did he mean. Now, there is a tremendous qualitative difference between two people talking. If a listener proceeds to say, you use words and they're mixed up, you don't know what you're talking about. The mood is then one of enmity. The mood is one of distance. I should like to develop that kind of human sympathy in which a man would be more moved to wonder, what do you suppose he means? What do you mean? And sometimes I've talked about these in unimportant situations, trivial, frivolous. Sometimes the consequences are far more devastating. Two examples. One from a biography by David Shub of Lenin. On December the 20th, 1917, Lenin instructed Felix Dzerzhinsky to organize an extraordinary commission for combating counter-revolution and speculation. Dzerzhinsky became the first head of this Soviet secret police, Organized, systematic mass terror was the instrument used by the Cheka. At meetings of this very high Soviet body, Lenin often exchanged notes with his colleagues. On one occasion, he sent a note to Dzerzhinsky. How many vicious counter-revolutionaries are there in our prisons? Dzerzhinsky's reply was about 1,500. Lenin read it, snorted something to himself, made a cross beside the figure, and returned the note to D. D rose and left the room without a word. No one paid any attention either to Lenin's note or to D's departure. The meeting continued. But the next day, there was excited whispering. D had ordered the execution of all the 1,500 vicious counter-revolutionaries. The previous night, immediately after leaving the room, he had taken Lenin's cross as a collective death sentence. There would have been little comment had Lenin's gesture been meant as an order for wholesale liquidation. But as Fotieva, Lenin's secretary, explained, there was a misunderstanding. Lenin never wanted these executions. Dzerzhinsky simply didn't understand him. Lenin usually puts a cross on memoranda to indicate that he has read them and noted their contents. Well, an occasion in which 1,500 men are destroyed because someone presumes that X means something. Now, words don't mean, only a person does. There is no meaning in a word. We sometimes talk about this as the container myth. Now, you can put something in a glass, water, dirt, sand, anything. A glass will hold something. And we can talk about this as a container. A word, however, is not a container in the way a glass is. The container of meaning is a man, a woman. It's you. It's you listening. It is I talking. It is I listening. It is you talking. A word doesn't mean for Dzerzhinsky to look at X and act as if that meant wipe them out. That is to look, incidentally, to think of how many different ways we use the word X in our society. X marks the spot. X is sometimes the signature of a man who can't write his name. X is at the bottom of a letter, a number of X's, an indication of goodwill and friendliness. That is, the word X doesn't mean anything, but in our approach to language, we have a tendency to think that a word is a self-containing center of meaning. It isn't. Words are sounds in the air, marks on the blackboard. Meaning is in you and in me. And thus, when Dzerzhinsky proceeds to respond to the X, he behaves in the mood A. He pays no attention to what the speaker may mean. Another illustration, which perhaps comes slightly more closely to our time. This appears in Secretary James Burns' book, Speaking Frankly. In a private conversation with Mr. Molotov, he says, it became apparent that another difficult problem had arisen between ourselves and the Russians. At the San Francisco conference, when the question of establishing a trusteeship system within the UN was being considered, the Soviet delegation has asked Mr. Stettinius what the American attitude would be toward the assumption by the Soviet Union of a trusteeship. Mr. Stettinius replied in general terms, expressing the opinion that the Soviet Union was eligible to receive a territory for administration under trusteeship. Mr. Molotov took this to mean that the U.S. would support a Soviet request for a trusteeship. Well, what does the word eligible mean? To me, that question isn't entirely sensible. What did Mr. Stettinius mean? Now, sometimes we use the word eligible. I suppose any of us is eligible to try out if you're an American citizen for the Olympic track team. But that doesn't mean you will get a place on the team. When Mr. Molotov asked, was the Soviet Union eligible? Mr. Stettinius replied, yes, you're eligible to ask for it, but that doesn't mean we'll get it. And then several months later, when it came to a vote, the United States voted against, giving the Russians one of the trusteeships, whereupon Mr. Molotov's equal proceeded to arise and speak devastatingly about the United States' refusal to honor its promises and obligations. And I should suggest that it makes a difference. What a man means, far more than that we pay attention to the words. In practice, this means a great deal. In our studies of the behavior and relationship between parents and children, children try to say things. And parents, sometimes in a hurry, impatient, proceed to dismiss them. We urge a very interesting kind of delay. We urge patience, an attempt to discover what is on his mind. Incidentally, we've come to a quite different attitude about what we mean by a boner. We find very few boners nowadays. For example, a teacher in the classroom, let's say in the civics class, the teacher says, "Who officiates when the president dies?" And Johnny in the 5th or 6th row raises his hand and says, "The undertaker." And the teacher proceeds to bawl him out. Now, that may be a boner from one point of view. From another point of view, Johnny interpreted his way. The teacher was interpreting it her way. And somewhere in the educational training, growth programs of young and old people, I should think it would be of enormous value if somewhere we got a sharp sensitivity of the fact that if we would understand a man, we must go way beyond his words. It becomes necessary to await patiently, to wonder what he means. Normally, if there is misunderstanding, we tend to blame the speaker. We tend to say he should have spoken more plainly. I now have come to believe that it is exceedingly difficult, no matter how simply a man speaks, for him to be misunderstood unless listeners seek to understand him. Incidentally, there is a game that can be played. We do not have time to play it in this session, and perhaps in the others, but it merely is this. If I want to misunderstand you, there is no set of instructions that you can give me that possibly can keep me from it. If I proceed to interpret your words in my way, it is very exceedingly difficult for you to do anything about it. And thus, we come finally to that tremendous conclusion that communication is a two-way process. It involves two people. Communication is not just one man talking. It is not one man listening. It involves two. And I suppose if we could come to any conclusion that makes more sense in the human communion process than any other, it is that it takes two to make communication. It takes a willing listener, and it takes a speaker eager to make himself understood. But in the hurry of the day, it is so easy for most of us to forget that as we pay too much attention to the words that we use.